Good afternoon. Welcome to the discussion. Overcoming geostrategic tensions. This is quite a task. In less than 1 hour, we'll try to do what the United Nations cannot achieve. There is not even a question mark on. Around the table to discuss it, either here with us or in the US, with the historian of globalization. She's a professor at MIT, Suzanne BERGER. Thank you for being with us live. This actually will start with you. You remember you tried to compare the various forms of globalization periods and see if we go towards a third globalization. Then we'll go to Marseille with other political stakes, but Rodolphe SAADÉ, CEO of CMA CGM, one of the leaders in maritime transport and logistics with us. Hello, Mr. SAADÉ. Hello. And then next to me in the studio, let's start with the other manager next to us, Patrick POUYANNÉ, CEO of Total. And with you and with Rodolphe SAADÉ, we'll try to understand what lessons you are drawing from this crisis. Are we heading towards the end of globalization with the increase of nationalism? Then His Excellency Chinese Ambassador in France, Shaye. Mr. Excellencies, thank you very much. China, of course, we want to know what you want and what you look for. I mean, all this within, we know there is a kind of a confrontation going on now with the US. And what would be the role of Europe, if you see a role for us? And then to introduce the discussion and set the stone and kick off the discussion, Patrice Arthur, chief economist at Natixis and a member of the Cercle des économistes. So thank you for being with us. Rapidly, you will have about 5-6 minutes per speaker. There will be a discussion among the 5 speakers, and then you will be able to ask your questions. Have a little pad, and I will be able to pass on your questions or what you want to know more. Patrick. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Now, to introduce this discussion on the geopolitical or strategic tension, a couple of reflections. First, this COVID crisis, like every previous crisis, caused the led countries to apply non-cooperative policies, and this takes the shape of what we call national preference, and therefore we would relocate, reshore. There is an increase of protectionism, reshoring, protectionism, technological leadership. We want to improve competitiveness to attract investors. And we talk about a return to sovereignty policies. So there is a kind of a non-cooperation going on, which is somewhat different from that of the past. In the past, there was exchange rate wars or recovery policy wars. Now there is quite the return of the states, returns of the nation around the will to produce as close as possible to the local consumer or domestic market. Now, this is illustrated every day, and the 4 speakers will give example each in their own domain. And I think for economists, there are 2 key messages and 2 questions. First, this takes place like after each crisis in a situation where there's a massive need for international cooperation. And therefore, there will be a problem there. That is basically how to implement non-cooperative strategies in an environment that calls for cooperation. Let me give you a couple of examples. Access to raw material, access to water, issues that are becoming more and more complicated. Monetary policies. Traditionally, there were always attempts to coordinate the monetary policies, so there will be probably an explosion of currencies and no international instance monitoring the whole process. Research, R&D, space, healthcare. Now every country comes up with local strategy, whereas the cost of access to medicine is higher. Research, R&D costs are higher. Migrations, of course, and development as such. And I'm quite amazed to see that in this crisis we've talked about, we still will talk this afternoon about China, the US, and Europe. whereas there is an insane crisis in the emerging world, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, a crisis which is a sanitary, economic, and financial crisis, and this should not be ignored. And climate change. There can be no global climate objective if there is no international coordination. In fact, we see actually diverging strategies. So my first point was to say, okay, this is all banal, trivial. We need more cooperation. And so bad news, we're not doing it. So in a more synthetic way, a more global vision, possibly, or comment, there will be in this new will to launch into national policies or sovereignties or return of an economic nationalism. There is a source here for three global conflicts. First, economic efficiency. Globalization did not come up by chance. It's not just for looking for lower production cost. Basically, it's exploiting cooperative advantages. If you do industry at large scale, it's difficult not to do it in China. There are skills or competence that cannot be found in other countries. For example, we don't have enough engineers in France, so we go and look for engineers in other countries. So this will, and therefore, again, it's not just looking for low wages. Globalization was to seek for the most efficient location to produce goods, and therefore, and improve the global production efficiency. Then Mr. Pouyanné will mention it. This is the inter-enterprises. Enterprises often they grew on global strategies. They're multinational corporations. They don't belong specifically to a territory except for the head office, but in terms of results and operation, no. And we'll see more and more states with a strong local will. Or what happened with PSA, the French car manufacturer. The PSA logic was to privilege employment of his Polish employees. The French state was to privilege employment in France. And we can see that they could end up with conflicts, with business logics for which there is the survival of the company, even in a multinational dimension, and a state logic. And then companies are organized to take advantage of globalization, to manufacture with a global chain of value or value chain. We're talking about regional chain of values, but the logic of, what the companies are looking for is its efficiency. Even though some companies today are thinking about the reshoring at the regional level because of the fragility of the globalization. But again, it's an issue of efficacy, not an issue of globalization or anti-globalization. Last point of my introduction to say that basically, in a sort of global and synthetic manner, for the last 40 years, our objective was consumer. We're targeting the consumer. Competition rules which are in favor of consumers. We did delocalization to draw up the prices. So principle was the purchasing power in the consumer. Let's be clear in the new strategy. That is, if we wish to reshore in France versus the emerging production, the price will double. That if we want to have national or European champions with a monopoly privilege that we'll have in the US and China, they will have that, but with higher prices. We have to be aware of the fact that this new strategy of states is not compatible with a strategy we're coming out of that is support of the purchasing power of consumers. And we see here, and I'll close on that note, that we kind of have a schizophrenic attitude. The objective is employment, production, and then the purchasing power, and often now will collide. Thank you, Patrick. Just a quick question. Could you, what are we heading for? I think the pressure of purchasing power is very strong. So there will be reshoring, targeted strategic reshoring, but which, I don't know how in France we could have labor-intensive industries. For example, the cost of labor, including social contributions, is €9 in Romania, 38 in France. You know, you can't bring the car manufacturing back in France. There will be kind of a purchasing logic such that it won't be a massive phenomenon. Okay, that's it. We kick off discussion now. We're going to the MIT Boston. Suzanne Berger, thank you for being with us. Happy National Day, by the way. What's the vision, your vision of the increase of nationalism, if not populism, in the U.S., bearing in mind the U.S. election is coming soon? You are the historian of globalization. You wrote books. You compared globalization now with that of the 19th century. Now, how do you see the trend now, the future of globalization? What's the future of globalization? Are we entering a third form of globalization? Today, we are at a critical point. The world needs coordination and cooperation, but our ability to produce international common goods has collapsed. It is a critical point in history because there are four major crises: the pandemics, the climate change crisis, rivalry conflict between the US and China, and fourth crisis, the very fact that open economy associated with globalization is now shrinking and closing. National borders are becoming more tighter in the world, and we don't have any common vision as to a new economic order, world economic order. We don't have any roadmap for the future. I'll start by discussing the last point, that is the closing down of borders and the shrinking of globalization. What should be understood is that it is both the leftist parties and right-wing parties that blame globalization for all their social problems: loss of jobs, fragmentations, increase of inequalities, lack of social mobility, increase of monopolistic corporations, loss of competitiveness, and increase of populism. And this fact that it is a fact that with the COVID-19 crisis, a more threatening dimension occurred, is that globalization seems to endanger the real needs of survival of the population, as masks, facial screens, respiratory devices, and drugs such as paracetamol. Those basic ordinary products are all produced outside of our countries. And then, in view of this crisis, in the US, for example, students in the fab labs of universities work days and night to produce facial screens with 3D printers. For example, women from religious communities, traditional religious of the Amish in Ohio, and were recruited to sew masks. So in a world where we have to now go back to artisans or cottage industry for public health, clearly globalization is really facing death. From overnight we ask for resistant supply chain and short supply chain, and not just the most efficient one or the less costly. Clearly, there is a high demand to produce essential goods at home. In France, for example, the state has just negotiated with 4 pharmaceutical corporations, French corporations, an agreement to produce paracetamol in France. As Patrick ARTUS just said, that's not a highly profitable business, let's face it. So, how will globalization evolve from there? Well, I see 2 possible scenarios. First would be reinforcement, hardening of national borders and protection with custom duties, custom rights, and state subsidies for national production of goods or essential goods. The list of essential goods will certainly lengthen. In this first scenario, we would see the triumph of nationalistic policies and the new rhetoric that would shame and blame our commercial rivals if it was an existential threat. In the US, we already see this scenario being implemented. And then essentially, well, I'm talking about Donald Trump's policy. But it's not just Trump's policy. It is also the policy of a major part of the Democratic left in the U.S. Even the most brilliant intellectual, this left wing considered that globalization is responsible for the increase of populism, and for them, clearly, there is a forced choice between globalization and democracy. It's like a dilemma. And for them, it is the nationalistic choices are at least evil. And I think that there is a second scenario that remains possible. And that scenario starts with the recognition de facto that the problems or the existentials of problems of today, pandemics, climate change, peace and war, economic order, cannot be solved by nations alone within their borders. We states can provide, yes, states can provide better safety in terms of employment, healthcare, and more fairness when it comes to the future life of the future of their children. But the major threats that are upon us, like pandemics, climate change, and so war, peace, economic order. Well, this cannot be solved, or can only be solved within an international forum based on rules and norms. To overcome such existential challenges, nationalism is a killer. Now, just allow me to conclude with one word about the domestic political situation in the U.S., because the evolution of the U.S. is essential to make this second scenario possible. In the last few years, the U.S. have been responsible for a large part of the destruction of international institutions and the trust needed between allies and partners. So what are the possibilities for us to react and play again a constructive role after the last 4 years? I know many of you doubt that the U.S. could restore and restore central values of our own democratic heritage. So, yet, I'm asking you to look at the faces look at the massive demonstration that took place last month all over America. Note that in many, many demonstrations, most of the faces were white. In our large institutions, companies, corporations, universities, municipalities, we have to acknowledge the wrongs, the injustice, and the will to change. I think the U.S. remain a country. America is a country that is still trying hard to reach its own values, a country where it would be again possible to make it a great country in and with the world. Make America great in and with the world. So I'll close on a moderate optimism for the second scenario. Very interesting what you've just said. We'll get back to this again with this new international order that you ask for, even though you remain skeptical as to the outcome. And then you show us the response of the U.S. about the fact that there is little international governance. We'll discuss it. Mr. Xu, okay. You're ambassadors of Chinese or China in France. So do you agree with what Mrs. Berger said? Are the U.S. largely responsible for the lack of or the loss of international governance? And what is the vision of China? We want to hear you in this China-U.S. conflict or problem. So, and what's the position of Europe? Yes, indeed. I fully agree. I fully agree with Mrs. Berger, Suzanne Berger. Yes, indeed. The US must have a large responsibility for the current disorders in the last few years, and everybody acknowledges that the U.S. and China are now face to face with increasing tension, and Europe between the U.S. and China. Well, Europe, what is the role? What is its role? Everybody is worried. So today, I want to just share my reflections in 3 points on this topic. First, China does not want to be into a confrontation with the U.S. You know, our priority is development negotiation, and even though China is already the second economy in the world, the GDP per capita is only on fourth position, fourth of that of the European Union. And we have a middle class of 400 million inhabitants, but we also have 600 million of inhabitants with a low or medium income. And this year, 2020, we are going to eradicate absolute poverty, the threshold being 4,000 yuan per year. That is 500 euros per year. But this will be eradicated. But relative poverty will remain for a long time. We know that. So China, in our first objective is to make it possible for the Chinese people to get a better life. And in fact, China is a country with an agricultural civilization. It has no expansionist gene. I mean, you know, we are not expansionist at the time. You know, James Cook, the British sailor, navigated 90 days to get to Australia. China is closer than Australia. 30 days would be sufficient to get to China, but China and the Chinese had never thought to occupy Australia, although it was only 30 days to Australia. So China has no ambition for aggression and expansion. You know, discourse saying that China is hard or aggressive are lies invented by the US to hinder the Chinese development and, fuel disagreement between China and its neighbor and its partners. I mean, you know, the tension between China and the US were never caused by China. And we always recommend the solving of problem through dialogue, negotiations, so that U.S.-China relations should always be based on coordination, cooperation, and stability, rather than falling into the pitfall of conflict. China doesn't want Europe to choose a position. China has always supported the European integration and wants to see a united, independent, and prosperous Europe. Between two powers, two civilizations, you know, China and Europe as two civilizations, you should be two major poles in a multipolar world. And Chinese-European relationship, healthy and stable, are beneficial to the two parts and to the world. Since the establishment of diplomatic relationship between China and the EU 45 years ago, you know, cooperation has always been a major aspect of our relations, and it has provided huge benefits to Europe between 2000 and 2018. Exportation from EU to China had an mean annual growth of 14.7%, creating almost 4 million jobs in Europe. Of course, China is also is benefiting from this cooperation, which is mutually beneficial for Europe.
Right now, we need to see China as an opportunity rather than a threat. With a geographic distance, that's quite important. China cannot represent a geopolitical threat for Europe, and even less so take over Europe. we can't consider the rapid development of China as a threat either. More China develops, more it will be able to offer a huge market to Europe, and the more it will be able to create new jobs. Virtuous competition between Europe and China can foster progress on both sides and benefit to the development and the prosperity of the world. China does not want and cannot control Europe. It considers Europe as a partner on equal footing and not as a competitor, an adversary. Our cooperation is more important than the competition, and our convergence goes well beyond our divergences. We hope that in return, Europe will see China in a much more objective way and on equal footing. The difference in ideology and political systems should not be considered as a blockage to our cooperation. A Chinese saying say that we can exist in harmony as different streams coming into one river. So Europe can also play a role in Chinese-U.S. relationships. The intervention of French diplomacy in 1964 was a major event that had influence on the course of history. For many years now, French-Chinese relationships were pioneers in the relationship between China and the West and created a great example of harmonious coexistence between the East and the West. Since the beginning of COVID-19, our President Xi Jinping and President Macron have had 4 telephone conversations, which illustrates this specific relationship, an important relationship between China and France. We need to work together for international cooperation to fight against this pandemic. And together we have written a new page of the Franco-Chinese friendship. Together we can win. Unis nous vaincrons. And after COVID-19, we hope that the Franco-Chinese relationship will bring the Chinese-European relationship to a better level and contribute to peace, stability, and prosperity in the world. Thank you. You made some very important points that will feed our debate. When you talk about cooperation, you put forward the cooperation between France, Europe, and China. At the same time, there was a meeting a few days ago where no progress was made in terms of trade between Europe and China. How do you explain the sticking point? Difficult cooperation. Well, there have been no tangible results, but it was a boost to bilateral development. The 2 parties are meeting for discussions, exchanging points of view, and even if we don't agree, we now understand what our objectives are for the post-COVID-19 period, and that was beneficial for everybody. So we're talking, and hopefully one day we'll come to an agreement. So we're going to Marseille now. Perhaps we'll have good news from the town hall with the mayor finally being elected. So Rodolphe SAADÉ, you're the CEO of CGM. You're present in 420 ports worldwide. What learnings are you drawing from these geopolitical tensions? I'm going to ask Patrick Pouyanné the same question soon. Thank you. I'm going to answer in 4 points. The first concerned the international dimension of CGM that is dealing with these geopolitical tensions within the framework of our activity, transport and logistics. We're really at the heart of these global economic exchanges. We're present in more than 160 countries, and we're confronted with many situations that are not always easy ones. The ambassador talked a bit about that. The trade tensions impact us. Piracy, natural hazards like hurricanes and earthquakes, and also health risks, and particularly the COVID-19 crisis that we've been through for the last few months. For the second point, COVID-19 will accelerate certain transformations that will lead to a different type of globalization, a new type. For our profession, I see an acceleration of regionalization with volumes that are growing on an inter-Asian basis and an intra-European basis. I'm not seeing massive relocations. I think that the difference in cost is too high, and China will remain the world's factory. What we noted during the COVID-19 period was an acceleration of digitalization, and I'm glad to be able to participate in this meeting in a digital manner. Today, I'm behind my screen talking to you, and last year I was in X, so digitalization is underway, and we're seeing a new way of working, a completely different way. It's not quite so friendly and charming, says Madame CHEVRILLON. Yes, you're right. It's not so convivial, but we'll come back to it next year, I hope. Next, energy transition, the fight against climate change must remain priorities. And a re-globalization is underway, a new type of globalization, and we hope that in the coming years, this globalization will be fairer and more respectful of the environment. But let's be careful about too great a focus on sovereignty. International trade is a factor for peace and development. I agree with Madame BERGER for many things, but I want to stay positive, and I think that with goodwill, and if we decide to move forward and work together and not each on their own horse, we will succeed. Thirdly, to overcome these geostrategic tensions, we must act individually sometimes to meet the challenges. CMA-CGM has a new mission to contribute to sustainable globalization through more balanced economic exchanges that will allow economic and social development in the respect of all human beings and of the planet. So this mission is based on 5 pillars: maritime development, logistical development, digital development, working on innovative solutions that are more respectful of humanity and the planet, and lastly, the development of our co-workers. So beyond profitability, which is essential to sustainably continue our development, we need to create value for our environment, and the group CMA-CGM has made strong commitments with an objective to be carbon neutral by 2050, the delivery of our first 23,000 container ship that's operated with natural gas will be launched soon. So we want to contribute to the well-being of our employees too, and we will set up an academy that's devoted to transport and logistics in order to continue to train our co-workers. To conclude, I am convinced that we can overcome geostrategic tensions together, collectively, and that is the role of the coalition that was announced yesterday. This coalition will meet in January under the, it will be chaired by Emmanuel Macron during the World Nature Conference. What we wanted through this coalition, which was at the initiative of CMA-CGM, we want to focus on actions that are effective rather than focus on words that just make noise. We want to carry out concrete actions. We want to be modern in the way that we operate, and we have 12 big groups, including Total, that have joined us. There's Amazon, Carrefour, the Crédit Agricole Bank, Engie, Forestia, Michelin, Schneider Electric, Barcida, who will help us to work together and to think about how we can accelerate the energy transition for transport and logistics in the coming years. Thank you. Thank you. So you don't really believe in relocation and reshoring, if I've understood your message correctly? Today, what we're observing is that intra-Europe transport is developing, intra-Asian transport also. But we'll continue to buy televisions and other products from China because it's much less expensive to produce there in China than in France and elsewhere in Europe. So we've understood. You were talking about the initiative that you launched with 11 other companies, including Total. So Patrick Pouyanné, you're here with us in the Radio France studios. When you look at what's been going on since the early March, what lessons can you draw from this when you manage a company as big as yours? I believe that we're living through a critical moment in terms of globalization. This crisis is an geopolitical accelerator. What are we observing? We're observing that the return of humans and politicians versus the economy. All of the economic contracts have blown up. The states are taking control again, and we've seen migration back to people's home countries to protect. People want to protect themselves in their home countries, which has led to huge migration. And we've seen in Western countries, in Europe, in France, public opinion that is expressing this feeling of dependency on the outside, and the fact that they're losing in status. And this leads to a call for sovereignty, food, energy, sovereignty. So though the world for the last 40 years has been built on something that's been beneficial for everyone, globalization brought 1 billion people out of poverty. But during the 40 years, we saw a focus on the economy rather than on policy. And big companies like mine, the Total that I am the president of, have been vectors of this march towards development, particularly for us in the world of energy. In a global extraterritorial reasoning. And today, on the other hand, we're seeing a call for more nation states and more territory. And this is where we're going to have to reinvent something. How can we combine the world that we need with these nation states? And for the companies that we are, it's going to be a real challenge. A challenge because we can't just say, my company is global, so I'm off the ground. No, companies all have home bases, and Total is a European company. When we talk about climate change, we have the same problem. Climate change is a global policy, and yet we have national policies governing the economy and the environment. Given all of this, we cannot forget that globalization has made everyone interdependent. Dependent isn't the right word. We're interdependent. China, the U.S., we're all interdependent on the rest of the world. China gets some natural resources from Africa. You can't have hegemony of just one single country. We can have a fractured world with two empires, China and the U.S. That is a simplistic view because we have built a system that has globally been beneficial for our efficiency, as Mr. ARTUS said. So the place of Europe now. Total is a European company. We recently adopted the status of European country that I wanted us to have, not only because our headquarters are in France, but because Europe is important. Why is it important? When you're a company, you depend on where your headquarters is and where the most of your employees are. And if in the world that's coming up, there are only two empires, China and U.S., and Europe is just a marketplace where people do business and develop their markets, I'm a bit worried for the future of our big European companies like Total in the next 20 to 30 years. So Europe has to benefit from this crisis to rethink our idea of sovereignty. It's going to be important for European companies. We need to have this sovereignty. Europe has not been built this way in the last 40 years, as Patrick Artus said. We built around a market because we wanted to fight against inflation, and we wanted to protect purchasing power. We protected a Europe of consumers and not of workers or of technology. And European companies, and there are big European companies that have been able to really profit from globalization. there are a lot of big European companies in the top worldwide. And I think that European sovereignty is going to be important. Multilateralism seems to have disappeared in the last few months. The United Nations Security Council hasn't met. I haven't heard about the IMF. I've heard a lot about the European Central Bank. So 40 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we would have built everything around the WHO, but now everything is every man for themselves. There's been a huge event. In the middle of this crisis, Donald Trump decided to remove 1/3 of the soldiers from Germany. And this would have merited more commentary, I think. I think we need to focus more on Europe of our defense that we need to build with our friends from Great Britain. We're going to have to find the means to rebuild a relationship with Great Britain. And this is going to be important for European companies. When I talk about relocation and sovereignty, as I said and Patrick said, if we want to relocate, it's going to cost a lot. We have to decide if we're ready as European consumers. But this is also true for energy transition, the Green Deal. It's going to be costly. Today, we're letting people believe that we can reshore, that we can transform the environmental and energy system without it costing a lot. That's not true. It's going to be expensive, but it's a political choice that we're making, and I think European citizens need to give their opinion on this. Companies like ours, we need to ask the question about moving closer to our European territories. I've had to make complicated decisions between over the last year on the Airbus of the batteries. The pure economic rationale, when we've talked with Carlos Navarrete and myself to join this battery project, wasn't easy because building battery factories in France when labor is at 38 euros an hour, it's not a simple economic industrial decision, but we've been able to build an agreement, a cooperation between states, France, Germany, and companies to say, we're going to take up this challenge together with subsidies. But what I observe is that we've been able to create around a technology that we considered as potentially strategic for the future of automobiles. The president of Total decided with their teams and the board that it was worth the cost of taking the risk. It's a daring risk. There would have been other solutions. It's risky to invest in this new technology. But why am I decided to take the risk? Because I don't think we really need to talk about reshoring, but rather the diversification of our supply chains. The geopolitical risk in the oil industry is something I know very well. There can be sources of supply and production. And so I would talk about diversification rather than reshoring. And Carlos Tavares, who wanted us to participate in this project, said that there will be batteries built in China. There will be batteries built in Europe. We need to diversify our sources. That's what I've understood. We shouldn't be refocusing on certain products. I don't think Doliprane, for instance, is necessarily essential to be produced in Europe. Economic sovereignty requires symbolic acts. I think that we need to take strong actions in Europe to protect our industry. And I think that when we talked about CO2 taxation at the border, that's going to be important, the carbon taxation, and it's going to be important to show that we have economic sovereignty. There are lots of questions that you've raised, but we only have 7 minutes to finish our debate. So I'd like to come back to Suzanne BERGER from MIT. When Patrick Pouyanné talks about the feeling of dependence and of losing status that people have, do you share that feeling? The question is not reshoring but all of our supply chains. We need to just grow them. I think for the economy in general, if we reshored everything, it would be a tragedy. I think we need to use this moment to go further in the direction that Mr. Pouyanné indicated, and that is to try to find the independence that can be quite expensive, the populist vision of this health crisis that has come out of this health crisis. So, Lu Shuai, you're the ambassador of China in France. There are a lot of questions on the internet. Is there hegemony? You said that it's not the history of China, but there is a de facto hegemony right now because you're the factory of the world. I say that in quotation marks. Can it become a political? Do you want to weigh politically in the world? We don't have the subjective will to turn our economic hegemony into political hegemony, but perhaps others may see this. Others might fear that China will use its economic power to have more political power across the world. But earlier in my speech, I put forward some evidence that China does not have expansionist genes. If you look at China's history, it's proven. Our foreign policy always focuses on peace and independence and cooperation with the entire world. We're not expansionist anywhere. A question about Hong Kong, Mr. Ambassador. Susan BERGER said that the U.S. and Donald Trump has taken apart global governance. And the new security law that's just been applied in Hong Kong, would you have implemented that at a time when the U.S. was still playing an important role in the world order? The law on national security in Hong Kong is a domestic affair. All countries have, well, I won't go over history, but there was an agreement that had been signed when the British left. That agreement was to define the duties and the responsibilities of both parties on the retrocession of Hong Kong to the return of Hong Kong to China in 1997. We've met all of our obligations in this agreement, and China has made political commitments in that agreement, but we've already achieved all of those commitments in a basic law on this special administration of Hong Kong. Patrick ARTUS, China, the factory of the world for the economic sovereignty and reshoring, but there are limits. I think we've all agreed around this table. We're going to reshore things intelligently, either things that are extremely strategic with the right model that Patrick Pouyanné described, the association between state and companies, which the Chinese and the U.S. do and the Europeans need to do. Or high-end things. We won't bring back labor-intensive industry. When you want to produce at a very large scale, you have to be in China. So we need to bear in mind that there is that limitation. So we'll see a return to Europe of targeted, intelligent products, hoping that the states will understand that it's the cooperation with companies that's the right instrument. Let me just say a quick word. It's important to understand what has just been said by Patrick ARTUS. In China and in the U.S., there's a big intertwining between the economic and the political system. The oil crisis that we've just been through was settled by Donald Trump in favor of the independent American producers. The AI started with the military investment in the U.S., and we need in Europe to build a system of cooperation between the states and defense industry and companies to irrigate and manage key technologies and not just work with Chinese technologies and American technologies, which are good. We talk about 5G, the problem of 5G, but we've created that problem ourselves. We've got 30 seconds left. So, Rodolphe, do you believe in the confrontation between companies and states? I don't want to talk about China, the U.S., or Europe. I'm talking about the world. The world is evolving. The world is changing. China is playing a more important role. The U.S. wants to maintain their role as leader. And we're, as a maritime transport company and logistics company, we try to navigate as best we can with the successes that we have to date. So, Patrick, the conclusion is yours. I'm happy with the agreement that we've come up with. But unfortunately, I think we're going to have to be it's going to require a lot of political courage and transparency to get the message across. Everything has a price, and there's no free lunch. That doesn't exist. Not for energy transition. There's no free lunch for reshoring or for technological developments. And we're going to have to tell people the truth about the cost of the strategic choices we're making. So globalization is an anthropological problem. Do you agree with that? No, it was a bit of a provocative question. So thank you to everybody. Unfortunately, we have to stop our debate now. So I'd remind you around the table that we had the Ambassador of China, Patrick ARTUS, and Rodolphe SAADÉ, and from CMA, CGM, and Suzanne BERGER from MIT. So the debate is over. Thank you, everyone.